The highway cracked beneath our tires like dried bone. It was 11 o'clock at night, and we were deep in the desert southwest on reservation land. It wasn't much of a highway, just barely paved, one lane in each direction and no lights, just reflectors embedded in the pavement. It wasn't uncommon to go an hour without seeing another vehicle. I was reading a book aloud when suddenly my partner, Leo, who was driving, slammed on the brakes. The truck fishtailed slightly on the gravel shoulder. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice tight. "No," I replied, turning in my seat. "See what?" "That van. It went off the road." I strained my eyes against the absolute blackness. "Nothing." Leo grabbed the heavy-duty flashlight and told me to call 911. This wasn't entirely unusual for us. I've worked in emergency response and Leo has a lapsed EMT license. But not being able to see the accident was a first. I got 911 on the line immediately, giving them the approximate GPS coordinates. The dispatcher asked me to cross the highway carefully and try to ascertain the status of the passengers. Leo had gone straight over a steep, scrub-covered dune. I trudged over the sand, nervous about the rattlesnake population, trying to juggle my phone and the flashlight. Finally, I crested the largest dune and could see the accident site. They had been lucky. The van had turned on its side as it slid, the friction of the sand barely preventing the entire thing from going over the edge into a massive canyon below. Leo called out to me. He was standing next to the vehicle, and next to him, standing with a scarecrow-like stiffness, was a young man. He looked dazed and wasn't answering questions. I got the darkest vibe off that guy I've ever encountered. Goosebumps crawled up my back. He looked like a permanent ring of shadow. I instantly made a point to keep visually checking on them. I proceeded to the van and called out. I heard a woman's voice inside. She was crouched in the passenger cabin, clearly in shock, her feet bleeding as she shifted in the broken glass of the driver's side window. She was tall and thin with dark hair, and next to her, a massive wolfhound was panting, equally stunned. The man must have pried the passenger door open and climbed out that way. The woman spoke calmly with an urgency I couldn't quite place. She and the man were on their way to Texas to visit family, living out of the van. I relayed the details to the dispatcher. 2 people not seriously injured, no fire risk. I tried to convince her to climb out of the roof or the back to clear away from the van, but she politely refused. Each time she said she didn't want to leave the dog. Her demeanor was oddly competent, so I put the strangeness out of my mind, assuming it was shock. Once I confirmed she was secure, I handed the phone back to Leo while I went out to wave in the paramedics, who had accidentally passed the site. As I briefed them, dispatch came over the radio. Please be advised that the male passenger is AMS and considered dangerous. AMS stands for altered mental status. We all stopped. The paramedics exchanged glances and one went back for additional equipment. I was eager to get back to Leo, but when we arrived, they were still talking quietly. Just as we were leaving, an officer taking our statements turned to us and said, "It's real messed up." He grabbed the wheel and overpowered her. It was a murder-suicide attempt. Leo filled in the details later. When he first got to the scene, the woman was yelling that the man had tried to kill her and begged Leo not to leave her alone with him. She insisted that if the man got out, he needed to be restrained as he was a danger to himself and others. Bewildered, Leo had helped the guy pry the door open. Once out, the man had just clammed up, doing nothing more than nod or shake his head. Leo had been doing his best to keep him engaged and distracted until help arrived. It was chilling to realize that the man I had been keeping a casual eye on was a murderer in the making. I think of the woman often, and of the sobering thought Leo shared later. If the man had chosen any other spot to grab the wheel for miles in both directions, they would have been over a cliff almost immediately. He had chosen the only spot where they realistically could have survived. The drive out of the desert that night felt different. The highway, once a simple strip of asphalt connecting 2 points, now felt like a fragile barrier separating us from the utter madness we had witnessed. We couldn't shake the image of the man's vacant, almost shadowy presence standing stiffly beside the crumpled van, or the cold reality that we had intervened in a murder-suicide plot. We reached the nearest city just as dawn was breaking. After giving our statements to the local police, a frustrating process of reliving the tension without being able to convey the sheer wrongness of the man, we finally got a motel room. That's when I truly realized the toll the event had taken. I had trouble sleeping not because of nightmares but because I kept listening for sounds that weren't there. A low tap, a shifting weight, the subtle sound of someone standing perfectly still just outside the door. 2 days later, back in our home city, the quiet horror persisted. We received a call from the police detective handling the case. He was professional but distant. "The case is complex," he explained. The victim, the woman, is recovering. Her statement confirms the attempt. She says he was getting increasingly controlling, but this escalation was completely unexpected. And the man? I asked. He's under psychiatric evaluation. Altered mental status was a severe understatement. He hasn't spoken a single word since the moment your partner helped him out of the van. He just stares. They found religious writings in his belongings, references to the desert being a testing ground and a place of final judgment. I hung up, feeling cold. The desert wasn't just a location, it was part of his narrative. A week later, our job, surveying remote sections of the highway for structural integrity, required us to drive the same route back into the desert. We pulled over at the site of the accident. The van was gone, towed away. What was unnerving was seeing the landscape during the day. As Leo had noted, if the driver had chosen any other spot for miles in both directions, they would have plunged immediately over a cliff. In the dark, the man had chosen the only feasible survival spot. It's like he knew, Leo muttered, standing beside me, looking down at the immense canyon drop. Even in his state, it's like he knew where not to go. Or, I suggested, the idea forming a cold knot in my gut, it wasn't him making the choice. We spent the next 2 weeks working in the silent, empty landscape. We'd drive for hours without seeing another vehicle. The routine was familiar, but the atmosphere was fundamentally changed. Every stretch of road felt like a trap, every sand dune a potential hiding place. We became paranoid, checking our rearview mirror every few minutes. One evening, we were parked off a service road, running ground-penetrating radar scans near a ridge known for mineral deposits. It was just past sunset. Leo was outside setting up the transmitter, and I was in the cab running the diagnostic. The desert was entering that perfect, absolute silence before the insects start their nightly hum. That's when I saw the figure. It was standing on the crest of the nearest dune, perfectly silhouetted against the bruised purple and orange of the horizon. It was tall and unnaturally thin. It was the man from the van. He hadn't been released from the facility. There was no way he could have traveled 1,000 miles and found us in this precise, remote spot. I grabbed the radio mic. Leo, get back in the truck. Now. Leo dropped the equipment and sprinted for the cab. I fumbled with the locks as he dove in. The man hadn't moved. He just stood there watching us with that scarecrow stiffness. That's impossible, Leo panted, staring at the dune. He's locked up. That's impossible. I put the truck in gear and slammed the accelerator, kicking up a rooster tail of sand and gravel. I drove straight back to the main highway, my eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. The man was gone. But I noticed something else. Taped to the passenger side window, the window I had been leaning against while watching the radar, was a small, perfectly square piece of paper. I didn't stop. I told Leo to grab it. He carefully peeled it off the glass. It was a handwritten note. The ink was dark, the script neat, almost elegant. It read, "This is the last place on earth you should be." The man from the van hadn't just found us. He was sending us a warning. And the chilling part? It felt like he was speaking not for himself, but for the desert itself. The note, "This is the last place on earth you should be," was folded tight in my pocket. It wasn't the threat that chilled me, it was the logistics. He was in a psychiatric facility 1,000 miles away, and yet he was here, standing on a dune and leaving a handwritten message on our truck window. We abandoned the survey mission entirely. Leo and I drove 3 straight days until we were out of the desert southwest, ending up in a small town in central Utah. We rented a remote cabin near a lake, telling the owner we were on a research sabbatical. We needed distance and quiet. I couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't just escaped. He had appeared. I started digging into the man's background. Using my old emergency response contacts and Leo's lapsed medical credentials, I managed to get the name of the psychiatric facility where he was being held. The name was Elias Vance. I called the facility, using a disguised voice, claiming to be an insurance investigator checking on a liability claim. The nurse on the phone sounded exhausted. "Mr. Vance is stable. Non-communicative. He hasn't left the secured floor since his admission. Are you sure he hasn't had any unauthorized outings?" I pushed. She gave a weary chuckle. "Sir, Mr. Vance is in maximum security. He's a flight risk, and a danger to himself. He hasn't seen the sunlight." The denial was absolute, but it didn't calm me. If he was in maximum security, how had he appeared on that dune? And how did he know where we were working? The answer was horrifying. The man wasn't just disturbed. He was tied to the very land we were surveying. The desert itself was his medium. The psychological warfare began immediately. It was subtle, insidious. I'd be looking at a map on the table, and when I looked back, a stretch of highway, the exact mile where the van flipped, would be outlined in pencil. Leo would wake up in the morning to find the kitchen sink running, having never touched the faucet. But the worst came one evening when Leo was out fishing. I was alone in the cabin, reviewing old case files on my laptop. The silence was intense. I heard a sound outside the cabin door, a low, rhythmic tapping. My blood ran cold. It wasn't frantic or aggressive, but deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. I grabbed the hunting rifle we kept for bears and moved slowly toward the door. Through the small window, I could only see the dark outline of the woods. I didn't open the door. I whispered through the thick wood, "Who's there?" The tapping stopped. The silence was so complete it hurt. Then, from the other side of the door, a new sound, a low, unmistakable giggle. It was high-pitched, nasally, and filled with a mocking, cruel pleasure. It was the giggle of the attacker in the first story I heard, the one who had jumped on the RV roof. This wasn't just Elias Vance. This was something that collected the memories of victims and used them. It was weaponizing the specific fear that came from being stalked in an isolated place. I backed away, rifle raised, heart pounding against my ribs. I knew then that the initial warning, "This is the last place on earth you should be," wasn't about the desert. It was about knowing too much. We had intervened in a pattern, and now the pattern was hunting us. The giggling continued, high and cruel, followed by a scraping sound that suggested someone was running a long knife or a sharp tool along the side of the wooden cabin. It was playing with me, trying to lure me out, using the exact psychological fear tactics I had read about in the initial reports. I shouted, "I have a rifle. Get away from the cabin." The sound stopped instantly. The silence returned, heavy and absolute. I waited for minutes, my knuckles white on the rifle stock, expecting the next move. When I finally looked out the window, the woods were dark and still. No sign of the stalker. No footsteps in the mud near the door. When Leo returned an hour later, he found me sitting on the floor, rifle across my lap, staring blankly at the door. I told him everything, the tapping, the mocking giggle, the scraping sound. Leo, being the pragmatist, inspected the exterior. "The lock is secure," he confirmed, checking the windows. "But look at this." On the wooden railing of the porch, scratched deeply into the rail with a sharp object, was a complex, swirling spiral. It was not a religious symbol, but a pattern, an elegant, confusing, non-Euclidean design that suggested motion. The desert man's writings, I realized, pulling up a photo I had secretly taken of the writings mentioned by the detective. The symbols matched. The man wasn't writing about judgment, he was drawing a map. Or a net. Leo, ever the EMT, focused on the immediate threat. He didn't break in, but he's here. We need to leave this location entirely. We packed the truck in under 20 minutes, heading north toward the next state border. We drove straight through the night, pushing the truck to its limits, desperate to put physical distance between us and the land that seemed to be actively generating our stalker. We stopped in a small town in Wyoming, checking into a sterile corporate motel near the interstate. I felt the first wave of genuine relief. We were out of the mountains, out of the desert, and surrounded by civilization. But the relief was short-lived. I woke up the next morning to find Leo standing rigidly by the window, his back to me. "Leo? What's wrong?" He didn't answer. I walked over and gently touched his shoulder. He flinched violently, turning to face me. His eyes were wide and his lips were trembling. "The key," he whispered, his voice thin. I woke up and the house key was gone. "It's just lost, Leo. We'll check your pockets." He shook his head, his gaze fixed on the asphalt parking lot below. "No. The key to our old apartment in Houston. The one you keep on your keychain. It's gone." I checked my keychain. The small, brass key to our old, flood-destroyed apartment was missing. It had been a useless piece of metal, a souvenir of a life that no longer existed. Why would he take that? I asked, my voice rising in panic. "It doesn't matter why," Leo said, stepping away from the window. "It means he was inside the room while we were sleeping. We tore the room apart, checking under the beds, in the closet, and the bathroom. Nothing." Then I opened the Gideon Bible resting on the bedside table. Tucked inside the Book of Job, marking a page, was a small, square piece of paper. It was a perfect, elegant drawing of the spiral pattern. And resting precisely in the center of the spiral, gleaming dully, was the small brass key. The man wasn't just collecting memories of fear. He was establishing ownership. He had entered our new location, taken a useless piece of our past, and returned it as a symbol of his control over our present. He wasn't confined to the desert. He was confined only by the information we gave him. We gave him the key to our fear and he used it to unlock our new location. The sight of the key resting on the spiral drawing was a brutal confirmation. The man, or the thing that used his form, was unbound by physical distance. He wasn't tracking us. He was anticipating us, or perhaps simply arriving wherever our fear settled. He had been inside the room. We have to stop thinking like we're dealing with a human stalker, I told Leo, my voice hoarse. This isn't about physical restraints or miles. It's about information and memory. We intervened in his pattern in the desert, and now he's trying to make us a part of his narrative. We realized the key was the final piece of the puzzle. The man hadn't taken it for utility. He took it because it represented the loss of our sanctuary, the life the flood destroyed. By placing it here, he was symbolically breaking down our new defenses. We decided on a strategy based on elimination. The man was obsessed with the isolation and the specific terror of remote environments. We had to move to a place that was the exact opposite: dense, chaotic, and impossible to track. We needed to drown his signal in the noise of a major city. We drove to Denver. We didn't book a hotel. We drove to the busiest, most anonymous part of the city, downtown near the Central Rail Station, and spent the first night walking. We stayed in motion, never giving him a fixed point, trying to generate enough ambient data, street cameras, public Wi-Fi, random noise, to completely obscure our presence. The relentless motion was exhausting, but it was working. For 2 days there was nothing. No pencil marks, no scraping sounds, no unsettling silence. We started to relax, finding refuge in the sheer anonymity of the crowd. On the third day, we found a small, cluttered apartment to rent on a month-to-month basis, paying cash. It was noisy, sirens, traffic, people arguing, and I cherished every chaotic sound. I felt safe surrounded by witnesses. We started to live normally, but the paranoia was a habit we couldn't break. I carried a massive can of bear spray everywhere. Leo developed a tic, constantly checking the ceiling. The subtle intrusion returned a week later. I was checking the mail, and tucked inside our box, beneath the junk flyers, was a single postcard. It was a generic tourist card of the Rocky Mountains, but the message, handwritten in the same elegant, chilling script, was personal. It read, "The noise is temporary. The pattern is always waiting for you where the air is still." He knew we were here. He knew our strategy. He knew we hated the silence, and he was mocking us by finding us in the very place we had chosen for its noise. I showed the card to Leo. His face went white. "The postmark," he said, flipping it over. It was mailed from Houston. The man was still locked up, 1,000 miles away, yet he was sending us mail, predicting our movements, and taunting us with the knowledge that our fear was his only limitation. We realized the deeper, more terrifying truth: he didn't need to physically be here. He had internalized our specific terror so completely that he was manifesting locally, pulled into existence by the intensity of our shared memory of him. We weren't being stalked by a man. We were being haunted by a psychological construct fueled by fear and isolation. The postcard was a psychological bomb. It shattered the illusion of safety provided by the city. We were hiding in plain sight, but the construct, the pattern, didn't care about witnesses or traffic. It cared only about the air being still in our minds. He's using the mail, I reasoned, pacing the cramped apartment. He's using a service that allows him to act from a distance. The mail system, the power lines, the radio waves, he's found a way to tether his influence to infrastructure. "So we can't hide," Leo stated, his eyes wide. "We have to confront the source of his obsession. We have to go back to the desert." It was a reckless, insane plan, but the only one that offered a chance at ending the terror. We had to break the connection to the land that fueled his madness. We packed the truck again, trading the dense chaos of the city for the vast, empty quiet of the Arizona borderlands. We drove back to the original accident site. The stretch of highway was just as barren and lonely as before. We pulled over, not near the service road, but directly across from the canyon drop. The sun was setting, and the desert was entering that perfect, absolute silence. Leo and I climbed the dune. The ground where the van had flipped was undisturbed, just sand and scrub. We set up 2 industrial floodlights aimed at the sheer drop into the canyon, bathing the immediate area in harsh, unnatural light. We were preparing for a confrontation. As the last light bled from the horizon, the silence deepened. The air grew cold. We waited. The construct arrived exactly at 11 p.m., the time of the accident. He wasn't on the dune. He was standing on the very edge of the canyon cliff, a few hundred yards away, perfectly framed by the stark vertical drop. He was impossibly tall and thin, his body swaying slightly, perfectly silhouetted against the night sky. He was the scarecrow figure, amplified, terrifyingly real. He didn't move. He simply stood there, a static charge in the air, radiating that profound, chilling darkness. He was waiting for us to panic, waiting for us to acknowledge his power. "He wants us to look at the drop," Leo whispered, citing the man in the scope of the hunting rifle. "He wants us to remember the choice he made that night, the choice between the head-on collision and the canyon plunge." I realized the final, crucial truth. The man hadn't accidentally survived. He had deliberately chosen the one spot that offered survival so he could continue his testing ground elsewhere. He was mocking life itself. I raised my own weapon, a high-powered parabolic microphone and digital recorder. "We're not going to shoot him, Leo. We're going to record him. We're going to treat him like data." I aimed the microphone at the figure. I didn't speak. I simply activated the recorder, capturing the perfect, heavy silence of the desert night. I was treating his manifestation as a phenomenon, removing its power as a sentient entity. The effect was subtle but visible. The figure began to tremble. His head tilted slowly, as if sensing the intrusion of the passive, scientific observation. He was being catalogued, not feared. I saw movement near his feet. A high, thin giggle, followed by the sound of a sharp object scraping against rock. The construct was attempting to deploy the psychological weapons we had internalized. "Don't engage, don't speak, just record," I commanded. We held our ground, bathing the horror in light and documenting the phenomenon with scientific indifference. The scraping sound grew frantic, then ceased entirely. The figure stood for 5 more seconds. Then, slowly, silently, and completely, the silhouette dissolved. It wasn't fading, it was unmaking itself, collapsing inward until the air was clear, and only the vast, indifferent desert remained. We kept the microphone running, recording the newly restored silence for another 10 minutes before shutting it off. The terror was gone. We hadn't destroyed him, but we had denied him the only currency he recognized, our fear and attention. We had won. We packed our gear, drove away from the silent desert, and finally truly left the pattern behind.